The Eritrean border, East Africa. An Italian column of 30 armored vehicles rolled south through the desert. Confident, well-equipped, modern. Facing them were 12 British armored cars that military analysts had declared obsolete before the war even started. Flat tires, overheating engines, armor plating so thin you could punch through it with armor-piercing rounds from 800 meters. The Italians had CV-33 tankettes, AB-41 armored cars, and artillery support. The British had the Marmon-Herrington, a South African-built vehicle that shouldn't have worked. Within 3 hours, 23 Italian vehicles were burning wrecks. The Marmon-Herrington crews hadn't lost a single car. This is the story of the armored vehicle that won the East African campaign despite being, on paper, completely inadequate for the job. How British and South African engineers turned a commercial truck chassis into a desert fighting machine, why Italian armor couldn't stop it, and what made this rickety collection of bolted steel plates the most successful armored car most people have never heard of. The story begins with a problem that had nothing to do with Italy. In 1938, the British Army needed armored cars for colonial policing across Africa, the Middle East, and India. Conventional armor from British factories was too expensive, too heavy, and took too long to produce. Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched preparing for war in Europe. The armored cars they did produce, like the Morris armored car, were designed for European roads and couldn't handle desert conditions. The South African government saw an opportunity. In 1938, South Africa had manufacturing capacity, raw materials, and a desperate need to contribute to imperial defense while building domestic industry. The solution was a partnership between the South African government and Marmon-Herrington, an American company that specialized in all-wheel drive truck conversions. The plan was simple. Take a Ford or Chevrolet commercial truck chassis, add four-wheel drive components from Marmon-Herrington, bolt-on armor plating produced in South African factories, and mount whatever weapons were available. The first prototype, designated the South African Reconnaissance Car Mark I, was completed in early 1939. It was crude. The armor was 12 mm on the front, 6 mm on the sides, and 4 mm on top. For comparison, German Panzer III tanks had 30 mm frontal armor, British Matilda tanks had 78 mm. The Marmon-Herrington's armor could stop rifle rounds and shrapnel. Heavy machine gun fire at close range would penetrate. Any anti-tank weapon would go through it like paper. The armament was whatever could be scrapped together. The Mark I mounted a Boy's anti-tank rifle, effective to maybe 300 meters against light armor under ideal conditions, and a single Vickers machine gun. Later Marks upgraded to a Bren light machine gun, a Vickers K machine gun, or occasionally a 2-pounder anti-tank gun if one could be found. There was no standardization. Crews mounted whatever weapons their unit could supply. Here are the specifications that reveal just how inadequate this vehicle should have been. Length 4.8 meters, width 1.9 meters, height 2.3 meters. Weight approximately 6 tons for the Mark II, the most common variant. Crew of 4, sometimes reduced to 3 to save weight. Maximum speed, 80 km per hour on roads, 40 km per hour cross-country under ideal conditions. Range approximately 320 km on internal fuel. The engine was a Ford V8 producing 95 horsepower or a Chevrolet Inline 6 producing 85 horsepower depending on what chassis was available. These were literally the same engines used in civilian pickup trucks. Production began in South Africa in 1940. By the time Italy declared war in June 1940, approximately 150 Marmon-Herrington armored cars were in service with South African and British forces in East Africa. Over the course of the war, South Africa produced approximately 5,700 Marmon-Herrington armored cars across multiple marks, making it one of the largest armored vehicle production programs outside of the major powers. Now here's where the story stops being about inadequate equipment and becomes about tactical genius. The British and South African commanders in East Africa understood something that Italian commanders missed. East Africa wasn't a conventional battlefield. It was thousands of square kilometers of desert, scrubland, and mountains with almost no infrastructure. The side that could move faster, operate farther from supply lines, and concentrate forces unpredictably would win. The Marmon-Herrington was perfect for this. The Italian forces in East Africa looked formidable on paper. Approximately 250,000 Italian and colonial troops occupied Italian East Africa, which included Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia. They had CV-33 and CV-35 tankettes armed with machine guns and occasionally 20mm cannons. They had Fiat Ansaldo AB-41 armored cars with 20mm guns and better armor than the Marmon-Herrington. They had artillery, aircraft, and established defensive positions. By every conventional military metric, they should have crushed the smaller British and Commonwealth forces. But the Italians made a fundamental mistake. They designed their tactics for European warfare. Their tankettes were slow, with a maximum speed of 42 km per hour and terrible cross-country mobility. Their armored cars were heavier and more powerful, but broke down constantly in desert conditions. Their supply lines depended on a limited number of paved roads. The Italian colonial troops were poorly trained and often reluctant to fight, and Italian commanders consistently underestimated the speed at which British forces could move. The Marmon-Herrington exploited every one of these weaknesses. The four-wheel drive system gave it exceptional cross-country mobility. British and South African crews discovered they could traverse terrain that Italian vehicles couldn't even attempt. Sand, rocky slopes, dried riverbeds, the Marmon-Herrington handled all of it. The lightweight meant lower ground pressure, so the vehicles didn't bog down in soft sand as easily as heavier Italian armor. The speed was devastating. Italian tankettes moving at 40 km per hour couldn't catch Marmon-Herringtons moving at 60+ km per hour across open desert. This created a tactical advantage that negated Italian firepower superiority. Marmon-Herrington crews could choose when and where to engage. They could hit Italian columns, withdraw before heavy weapons could respond, and reappear kilometers away to hit again. The Italians called them gin cars, ghost cars, because they seemed to materialize from nowhere. Range was equally important. The 320-kilometer range didn't sound impressive, but British forces developed a leapfrog supply system using trucks and cached fuel dumps. Marmon-Herrington units could operate 200 kilometers behind Italian lines, raid supply convoys, and return before Italian forces even knew they'd been there. One documented raid in February 1941 saw 12 Marmon-Herringtons travel 180 kilometers into Italian-held territory, destroy a fuel depot, ambush a supply column, and return without losses. The tactics evolved rapidly. British and South African crews abandoned conventional armored car doctrine and developed hit-and-run techniques that resembled cavalry raids more than mechanized warfare. A typical engagement worked like this. Scout cars, usually Marmon-Herrington markers with machine guns only, would locate an Italian column. They'd report position and composition to the main force. Marmon-Herrington Mark IIIs, with Boy's anti-tank rifles or 2-pounder guns, would approach at high speed from an unexpected direction, usually across terrain the Italians considered impassable. They'd engage at 400–600 meters, maximum effective range for their weapons, but beyond effective range for Italian machine guns. If Italian armor moved to engage, the Marmon-Herringtons would withdraw at high speed. If the Italians didn't pursue, the British cars would reposition and attack from a different angle. This sounds simple. It required extraordinary crew skill. Driving a 6-ton vehicle at 60 km per hour across rocky desert while navigating by compass and dead reckoning demanded constant concentration. Gunners had to engage targets while moving at speed, compensating for vehicle motion and range estimation. Commanders had to track multiple vehicles, coordinate fire, and make split-second decisions about when to press attacks and when to withdraw. Radios were unreliable, so units often operated using visual signals and prearranged tactics. The results were disproportionate to the vehicle's specifications. During the East African Campaign from June 1940 to November 1941, Marmon-Herrington units were credited with destroying or capturing approximately 400 Italian armored vehicles, though exact numbers remain debated by historians. What's documented beyond dispute is that Italian armored forces in East Africa effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force by mid-1941. Not because they were destroyed in conventional battles, but because they couldn't operate against an enemy they couldn't catch or pin down. But the Marmon-Herrington had serious problems that historical accounts often minimize. The thin armor meant crew casualties were high when vehicles were hit. Italian 20mm rounds would penetrate at any combat range. Even heavy machine gun fire could kill crews through the side armor. South African casualty records from the East African Campaign show that Marmon-Herrington crews suffered disproportionate losses compared to infantry units, even though the vehicles themselves had relatively low loss rates. The vehicles broke down constantly. The commercial truck components weren't designed for military use. Transmissions failed. Differentials cracked. Suspensions collapsed under the stress of cross-country driving at high speed. Maintenance was continuous. Crews spent as much time repairing vehicles as fighting. One unit history notes that of 12 Marmon-Herringtons assigned to a squadron, an average of 4 to 5 were operational at any given time, with the rest awaiting parts or repairs. The armament was barely adequate. The boys' anti-tank rifle could penetrate Italian tankette armor at close range, but struggled against the AB-41 armored car. The 2-pounder gun was effective, but ammunition was scarce. Crews often had fewer than 20 rounds per vehicle. This meant every shot had to count. Miss, and you might not have enough ammunition to continue the engagement. British after-action reports consistently requested better armament, but production constraints meant most Marmon-Herringtons fought the entire campaign with machine guns and boys' rifles. The crew conditions were brutal. No air conditioning in vehicles operating in temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. No sound insulation, so engine noise was deafening. Limited storage, so crews had to choose between ammunition, water, and food. No sleeping accommodation, so crews slept under the vehicles or on top of them. Dust infiltrated everything. Equipment failed. Water was rationed. Heat exhaustion was common. Several accounts describe crews losing consciousness from heat while inside closed-up vehicles during combat. Yet, despite all these problems, British and South African forces preferred the Marmon-Herrington to any alternative. Why? Because alternatives didn't exist. The campaign against Italian East Africa was a secondary theatre. Britain was fighting for survival in North Africa and Europe. Equipment sent to East Africa was what couldn't be spared elsewhere. The Marmon-Herrington was available, producible in theatre, and good enough for the mission. The psychological impact on Italian forces deserves attention. Italian soldiers in East Africa faced an enemy they couldn't see until it was too late. Marmon-Herrington units operated at night, in dust storms, across terrain Italian maps marked as impassable. Italian defensive positions designed to channel attackers into killing zones were simply bypassed. Supply convoys that should have been safe 50 kilometers behind the front were ambushed. Italian morale collapsed not because of casualties but because of unpredictability. You couldn't defend against an enemy who appeared anywhere, at any time, moving faster than your forces could respond. The terrain itself favored the Marmon-Herrington's strengths. East Africa featured long sight lines, minimal cover, and vast distances between objectives. Italian forces concentrated in defensive positions along the few paved roads. British forces used the Marmon-Herrington's mobility to operate in the empty spaces between Italian strongpoints. They cut supply lines, isolated garrisons, and forced Italian forces to disperse, trying to defend everywhere. Classic economy of force. The smaller British army used superior mobility to make the larger Italian army irrelevant. The campaign's decisive phase came in early 1941. British and Commonwealth forces, including significant South African contingents, launched coordinated offensives into Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia. Marmon-Herrington units spearheaded these advances, operating as reconnaissance and raiding forces. They identified Italian positions, harassed supply lines, and exploited gaps in Italian defenses. The speed of the British advance, covering hundreds of kilometers in weeks, was enabled almost entirely by the mobility of these allegedly obsolete armored cars. One engagement demonstrates this perfectly. In March 1941, at the Battle of Keren in Eritrea, British forces faced heavily fortified Italian positions in mountainous terrain where armor seemed useless. Marmon-Herrington units couldn't assault the positions directly, but they could cut the supply road behind Italian lines. For 2 weeks, Marmon-Herrington patrols operated 40 kilometers behind Keren, ambushing supply trucks, destroying fuel dumps, and forcing Italian forces to divert combat troops to protect supply lines. This wasn't glamorous tank warfare. This was grinding attrition that made Italian positions untenable. By November 1941, Italian East Africa had surrendered. The campaign is often remembered for infantry assaults and conventional battles, but military historians consistently note that British mobility advantages, primarily provided by Marmon-Herrington armoured cars, made those victories possible. The Italians had more troops, better defensive positions and interior lines. They lost because they couldn't match British operational tempo. The post-war assessment tells the real story. The Marmon-Herrington continued service in British and Commonwealth forces through 1945, seeing action in North Africa, Madagascar, and the Middle East. But its greatest success remained East Africa. Why? because nowhere else did conditions so perfectly match the vehicle's strengths. The desert favored mobility over armor. The distances favored range and reliability over firepower. The enemy favored hit-and-run over pitched battles. Modern military analysts studying the East African campaign focus on one lesson. Equipment specifications matter less than how equipment is used. The Marmon-Herrington should have lost against better armed, better armored Italian vehicles. It won because British and South African commanders understood that tactical mobility, operational unpredictability, and crew skill could overcome material disadvantages. They built doctrine around the vehicle's strengths, accepted its limitations, and used it for missions where those strengths mattered most. Return to that January 1941 engagement. The Marmon-Herringtons attacked from 3 directions at 50 kilometers per hour across impassable ground, engaged at 500 meters. Within 30 minutes, half the Italian column was burning. This happened hundreds of times. Italy lost East Africa in 18 months because they couldn't counter an enemy who moved faster and refused conventional battle. That's documented. This commercial truck chassis won not because it was good, but because it was exactly good enough for the mission. That's why this obsolete armored car succeeded where better vehicles would have failed.